Welcome, welcome. We are very excited to share an iconic moment in Cohort 21 Season 9 with Mary-Lou. And how do you pronounce your last name?
O'Brien.
O'Brien, thank you. And welcome. We are so excited to talk to you. The time and place for this conversation couldn't be more current given our step into our second Ontario lockdown, and as all of our independent schools are now faced with the next month of being together online and being truly blended, we have to constantly remind ourselves that we are new to all of this in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of amazing research and guidance and expertise well ahead of us that have been playing in this space for a long time that we can learn from. And you, as I have read now from some of the articles that Garth sent me, and now and I've also learned from Garth, have a wealth of expertise to share with us this evening. So thank you so much for joining us. And wondered if you might just start off with letting us know a little bit
Wait,
about you.
Justin.
Yeah.
Wait, I got to introduce her.
Oh, you want to do that first? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So Mary-Lou is a digital transformation consultant. She's an educator. She works in the space of like e-retail. She is a self-proclaimed global explorer and forever a student. And I had the honor and privilege actually working with Mary-Lou through our shared connection of my principal, Catherine Misson at Havergal College, who is also an Aussie, like Mary-Lou. And they used to work together. So we share that, which I think is great. And right away, in the first time I interacted with you, and then through our ongoing conversations the last couple of months, I think something which I really, admire about you, and something which I learn from you all the time, is this: you are forever a student. And very rarely do you say, no, there is only one way, there is only one answer. So I've really enjoyed our work together. And when we started thinking about what do we want to do in this next face-to-face, I think it's important that we take a step back and look at a more global picture. And you have that experience. You work with several different schools and have for a long time. And you have wisdom to share. So that's why I wanted you to join us and sort of share that with us. Plus, every time you speak, I get energized. You have such a great way about you. You have great sense of humor, and you come at learning with a sense of joy. And so I think that would be a real privilege for us to experience that.
Thank you so much. What a lovely introduction. Probably the best I've ever had. Thanks, Garth. I love that you touched on that global, and you did too, Garth, too, because I think that is really important, and certainly been something that I've been driven by, is my own travels. And many years ago, I actually had a background in travel and tourism and worked as a travel consultant. So moving into education, where I lost that, I actually was able to incorporate that in school visits, so that I would incorporate school visits when I did travel. And that's how I really know of both of you, is through those travel engagements.
Nice.
Oh, that's great. Well, maybe take us through some of your career in education, and maybe some of your most recent engagements and things that have brought you joy and a lot of kind of interest.
Yeah. Well, I've only been consulting since the start of last year. So I launched in February, and by March, Melbourne, Australia, we were in lockdown. So in some ways it was great timing, because everyone was on the bandwagon, the online learning bandwagon that was about to launch us all into a whole new world. And so that's been really positive, and I've loved it. But I did really find that experience of lockdown, and on a global scale, and working with educators from across the world, and school leaders in particular, the burden that placed on everyone too. There was, a global stress level, I think, that we were all trying to manage. And even though I wasn't working in a school, at times last year I felt burnout, and that was just because I felt I was online 24/7 like you all were, and I was trying to buoy those educators up as well and share my knowledge and try and impart my knowledge quickly and in meaningful ways as they were just starting on this journey.
Yeah, and part of the way that we met in your global travels was on this notion of digital transformation, but also understanding what our students are going through. And in your latest article, which we're going to share with our Cohort 21 group, in your latest article, you chose the title, "Has Pedagogy Had Its Day?" And you chose it in order to provoke and spark conversation and discussion, all those things. And for me, it has. So in it, you write, I'm going to quote you on this, "In the recently released World Economic Forum Future Jobs 2020 report, they note that the skills gap we face in the lead up to 2025, scarily not that far off, includes critical thinking, analysis, problem solving, and self-management. And this places pedagogy in the lead as the delivery model that can support the acquisition and development of these very skills." And in your article, you have a great chart, which is the spectrum of Augies, right? Like pedagogy, all those things. So tell us more about this. Tell us, what is pedagogy, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and why you see this as one of the next steps.
Yeah, look, I suppose I'd been introduced to it many years ago coming through higher ed. So that was my most recent background before coming into the K-12 sector, and it was my introduction to education. And so my team of lecturers and myself, we were teaching adult learners. And so it was very much about self-determined learning. And that is what pedagogy is. It's self-determined learning. And it's just a student-centered instructional strategy, whereas pedagogy is far more teacher-centered. It's a strategy that emphasizes the development of autonomy, capacity, and capability. And then there's research that underpins it that says that it improves participation, it improves retention of knowledge, it can boost performance levels, it fosters collaborative learning, which develops problem-solving skills, it facilitates personalized learning. And one that I love, it makes learning more fun. And I think particularly that last one, but all of these things lead to learners who will be lifelong learners. And that's the aim, isn't it? We're trying to equip students for complex workplaces that most of us cannot even fathom what their workplaces will be like in another 5-10 years. And I think this is a strategy that will really support our students and prepare them in the best way.
And yes. And in this article, I'm just going to build on that, because in the article you get you communicate a bit of a frustration. And you say you've heard over and over educators this year that our senior students would in fact be better prepared for their university experience than ever before. It frustrates you, because haven't we always recognized this disconnect? And for me, and Justin, I'd love to hear something from you on this too. I've been looking at theories of engagement, right, in learning, and there are, the research is centering around these 4 key elements of engagement: meaning, belonging, purpose, and agency. So those are the 4 key elements, and they work together, but you can tease one out. And I think that something like shifting to this type of approach builds on that autonomy and that agency. And I think that is so important. And I'm wondering, what role does maybe technology play in that? What role can educators play in shifting their practice this way, knowing that our traditional models have shifted so much, our timetables have shifted, where we do the learning, whether it's digital, in person, high flex, whatever, has shifted. I'm wondering if either you or Justin have any comments or suggestions on that.
Well, I was just going to say that the technology, I think, just provides us the tools to enable it. you know, just being, whether it's, you know, the personalized learning is an interesting one. And I think we're probably seeing some of these things come out of remote learning as we've seen it in 2020, and we'll continue to see these things happening. So I think it's almost like a natural adoption of some of these things that will start creeping in. They just haven't ever been envisioned as being options for K-12 students before. It was seen as something, you know, magically they turn 18 and they're thrown in the deep end at university, and all of a sudden they're meant to to swim and not or float and not sink. And you know, there has been, certainly when I was in higher ed, there was a lot of talk about particularly students from independent schools getting to university and being so used to being spoon-fed content that they were the ones that were the majority of dropouts in the first year of university. And so that has always been very much on my mind. And when I came into the K-12 sector, that was something that I really wanted to focus on as well.
Yeah, you know, it occurred to me that when we think about our, you know, maybe reluctance to play in a more, I guess, self-determined space with younger kids, it tends to be through this lens of classroom management, right? So when, and I think a lot of this through the kind of language of like urgency. You don't typically shift your practice until you're finding a meaningful why that's like quite urgent and in front of you. And in this case, with everyone spread out, you've got a pretty urgent why. And I've seen and had these conversations with a lot of teachers who are now taking up some of the tools that I've had in place for a long time. They just never had the urgency to do so. Now they're very happy to know that they exist and sit there. And now they're kind of stepping in. But it occurred to me that we tended to over rely on this kind of the executive functioning skills of our older students, because we knew that they had them. So you could put them in spaces where you could give them choice and voice and then go off on their own, because the management side didn't come back to bite you, right? Like tended to like follow up. But now I think faced with quite exhausting days, quite full on, and you know, and then those of our teachers who tend to have, you know, have dependents or the various ways that they're kind of spread thin, I think they're finding a pretty urgent calling to explore some of these different approaches and finding out quite quickly that the kids are meeting them halfway or more, you know, like they're like, oh wow, I threw in, like I never thought they would take this choice board up and follow through in the way that I designed it, and they're getting surprised. Or that maybe they didn't go all the way, but that wasn't because they couldn't. It's just they hadn't had a lot of practice at it. And so this reframing of practice, you know, they're never going to just get it off the first try. But actually, if we take a long view, then wow, what if I keep at this and think about it over like between now and June with a goal of like reassessing where they started and where they ended, how surprised might I be by how far they get?
Yeah. Look, one of the areas I've focused on too is that, you know, as Garth touched on, that gap and that frustration for me around that gap between, you know, final year of schooling and entering university. But I also think there's often a big gap in schools between primary, elementary and middle for you, I think.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And that gap. And I quickly came to realize that we needed to showcase some of the work that was happening down in, you know, even early learning centres, where we were introducing coding and girls were coding with Bebots. And then they'd get to primary and that might be something that they'd be introduced to again in year 2. And it's like, they've done that. Like, yeah. You know, and so often there's that gap in the curriculum and it's not mapped fully. You know, I was fortunate in the last school I worked at, one of the things we did was that we brought in specialist teachers to the junior school. And one example of that was we had the head of science, who was an absolute extraordinary woman. She actually took the middle year students for science so that she could actually see what work needed to be done with the curriculum in the senior years. so that she got that full picture and worked with, you know, ELC teachers, junior year teachers. And I know, you know, that's time consuming and someone needs to lead that work really, but it is vital work. And particularly if you're looking at student engagement, and ensuring that they're not, you know, you're not introducing ideas, tools and curriculum that they've already well and truly covered.
Yeah, I think this conversation is reminding me of some of the projects that I'm doing at my school. We're doing a lot of research in terms of developmental, the developmental span, but how, as you're saying, Mary Lou, some things actually, you know, they're circular. And there's a great article which we read, and it's called Kindergarten. What is it called? It's called Lifelong Kindergarten, Cultivating Creativity Through Projects, Passion, Peers, and Play. And it goes through, it's one of the chapters that we read. And it says, to meet the needs of a creative society, we need to break down many structural barriers in the education system, break down barriers across disciplines. We need to provide students with opportunities to work on projects on their own, allow people of all ages to learn with and from each other and to learn differently. Does that resonate with you in terms of Shootology, in terms of those types of things?
Absolutely. I always say the school timetable is the biggest
challenge, barrier
to innovation. It's the biggest barrier to innovation there is in any school. And I love that learning from anywhere. It was announced yesterday, and it has happened in years past, but there was an article yesterday here in Australia about a new kindergarten that has just been set up in an aged care facility.
Oh, wow.
And so there was a series on TV here last year about where there was an aged care facility where they were bringing in kindergarten students for a day a week or something, and they filmed the interactions. And it was just like, everyone was like, oh, you know, it was just amazing, the learning, but also the impact it had on the elderly as well, and how excited and, you know, and just what they could teach these very young children. So I find that, really interesting, and certainly taps in.
I think this conversation is a good example of what I'm starting to see now normed across K-12, which prior to this maybe wasn't as possible. And again, back to urgency, wasn't as urgent, which is the idea of bringing outside expertise in. And now that, like, we've solved platforms, we've solved access, we've solved a lot of things that would have been maybe only kind of, you know, maybe the most kind of tech inclined teacher would have taken on that extra kind of work of learning all that. Now I'm finding, you know, parents, experts, all kinds of thought leaders are finding their way into classroom, and the teacher shifting their thinking around, I do not need to be the expert at all times. At all phases of learning, and I can do lots of creative things. And then that slowly shifts into kids teaching kids, and, you know, relinquishing some of that control, which is some of the really interesting kind of strategies that I'm seeing play out in classrooms.
Yeah, and I'll use that to jump into sort of shifting the conversation a little bit, because once, as Mary Lou had already said, you know, technology is a lever. It doesn't drive the learning, but it is a lever. And this school closure has really put technology a little bit further up on the quiver of the teacher, right? The tools that the teacher are reaching for. And so, Mary Lou, you've worked with a number of schools on digital transformations in the education JK to 12. What are some of your big learnings about digital transformations in this area? What do educators who are, you know, our audience today is primarily educators, what do the educators listening to this need to know about why digital, you know, I use that term, digital writ large, why is that something to get behind, to invest, you know, this very valuable thing called time? Why should they be investing their time into getting behind digital?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose what I found is that in the ed sector, there is certainly a lot of distraction by the shiny new products and the hardware and devices on the market. They're often the toys that you see in schools. Whereas I believe the real work needs to start with the culture, and also the infrastructure is really important too. So to me, successful digital transformation isn't just about the technology at all, but it really relies on the people that are involved. The culture is about bringing people along on that journey with you. And I'm a big believer in having a strong school vision or a strategic plan, so that everyone's sort of working from the same, on the same page. And with that, you've got, I call it an anchor. So when I work with schools, I talk about, you know, it's an anchor for everyone, a reminder of what's at the core. And it's about listening to people and provoking people's thinking, which is one thing I really enjoy doing, as you can tell. And when I talk about provoking thinking, I was talking about that earlier this week with someone that had posted a video of their 3-year-old using VR goggles for the first time.
I've seen that too.
Yeah, and their reaction. And I said to him, you know, that's the sort of clip that I would take to a presentation to educators. And 10 years ago, in one of my first presentations when I was at Melbourne Girls Grammar, was I filmed my 1-year-old nephew on being handed an iPhone, and filmed how quickly he learnt to, you know, the icon for where the photos were. And he knew how to find photos of himself, and how he played like a matching or pairing game. And my provocation was to them, he's one. In 5 years' time, he's going to be sitting in front of you in a classroom. How are you going to engage this kid who's been on a device since he was 6 months old, virtually, you know? So, you know, I think that's fascinating. But Justin also touched on it. The biggest one for me is shifting that mindset around failure. So with digital transformation, I really think that teachers are no longer the fountain of all knowledge. They need to accept that they will be learning alongside students, and sometimes learning from the students in the classroom when it comes to technology. And so, you know, fail for me is that first attempt in learning. And it's being really mindful that people require support. I highlight little things too, like the IT and e-learning support staff really need to be visible, to be in high traffic areas of your school. I've always believed in having an open door policy, so that, you know, we tried to avoid, you know, appointment schedules, that it was just open door and you drop in when you need me and I'll be available to you. So it's also for teachers really to recognise that they no longer have to be the experts, and they will be supported by the school in that mindset, because it is a huge shift as well. And then the infrastructure I'll just touch on, but, you know, certainly moving to remote learning. Everyone's off site doing remote learning. And then principals are all saying, well, we want this to continue when school comes back. Let's look at other models of online learning, blended learning. Well, when they're all back on campus and you have 1,000 students plus teaching staff all working online, is your infrastructure going to hold up to that? And also being mindful that if you're doing true online or blended learning, you need them online 24/7, 365 days a year. And that's a whole other level of infrastructure to be able to deliver on that. And often school leaders sort of just put that aside, oh, we're going to do this. And then when it falls over, it's all, oh, technology is too hard, technology doesn't work. There needs to be more planning in this. So that's where I come into, I suppose. The second part of the question was, what do the educators listening to this need to know about why digital is something they need to get behind? For me, digital skills can no longer be an add-on. And really, all learning needs to be constructed now around the emerging future of work. And it's the digital economy that's driving it. So it's not your school principal or your local, representative, senator for education or minister for education. It's actually our digital economy is requiring it. And certainly for classroom teachers in Australia, it's no longer an option. I'm working with a school at the moment on the digital technologies curriculum that's come out. And that's now on equal footing that we have digital technologies embedded from elementary to high school, and it's on equal footing with English and maths, which, that's a huge thing for teachers to get their head around too. So, before COVID, many school leaders were pursuing initiatives that would help them improve the student learning experience and drive better outcomes. But I think because of COVID and this shift to remote learning, as well as all the feedback we're getting from students, parents, and educators, we've now realised that helping teachers build expertise with online spaces and digital tools is a way that we can achieve those goals. Mm-hmm. So it's really, really exciting for me to just witness how we've leaped ahead, and probably at least 5 years ahead from most schools in just 1 year. And that's on a global scale too, with all educators and students having experienced remote learning, that upskilling is just off the charts. And Justin, as you alluded to too, the teachers have quickly come to realise that students are actually willing to learn differently. And school leaders have come to realise that teachers are willing to teach differently. It's happened.
And I think too, as administrators in schools, our understanding of professional learning needs to shift as well. What we know about adult learners, particularly professional adult learners, is a just-in-time model is far more effective than, sometimes shipping them out to a conference or giving them the time. It's more just-in-time learning. And then for me too, it's a forum approach, like a social networking approach, so that adult learners are learning from other adults in the building. I mean, specifically in terms of a learning organization, that for me is a big shift that's happening as well, that they have to also, they have to learn and get trained alongside during the school year, alongside their students. That's a big shift that's happening as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, every minute of professional development that we organized for our staff this year was just in conversation, because I think we recognized that we were inventing new pedagogies, especially in the way that we were being constrained by this notion of high flex and cohorts. No blended learning model had ever had that kind of imposed on it, right? There was always this kind of, sense that you're either here or you're there, not this like two simultaneous. And it occurred to me as you were talking, Mary-Lou, that we're faced with a time when the teachers now are more of an expert in this pedagogy or these approaches than the administrators, who were once kind of your lead teachers, and they kind of came to these roles as being really, strong teachers, and that's a lot of the kind of upward momentum happened that way traditionally. So we're faced with rethinking our growth and evaluation models on some level, because we'll soon need to say, this is the best way to do it. And when we teach at our school, we teach these ways in the way that we have always relied on this kind of canon of like great teaching and learning, since when the days we started documenting it. So have you come across schools that have been brave enough to kind of say, these are our baselines, and when we teach in these kind of conditions, these are the kind of approaches, or these are the kind of strategies that we want to see on a kind of
I think that's really only just emerging here. We've had we've had 2 major lockdowns already in the 1 year, so I can't remember how many weeks we got up to that the students had missed a school, but it was one of the highest rates of absences from the school site globally, in Melbourne, particularly in Melbourne, Australia. The rest of Australia seemed to do quite well, but we've experienced 2 major lockdowns so far. So because of that, I think I'm seeing more movement probably interstate, because they've had time to regather their thoughts. We're just coming out now of a 6-week Christmas holiday period. So it's the end of January that most staff will be back on campus and ready to tackle the new year. And I think school leadership was very aware that they needed to give teachers that 6 weeks recovery period, really. So they've been very reluctant to push too hard, but there is certainly a lot of talk about it. There's certainly, you know, a lot of the schools I'm working with, it is about, well, what do we need to retain, or what do we want to retain, and how we go about doing that? And that's where I'm working with them and supporting them on that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've learned at Havergal anyway is that the role of the teacher is always going to be the most important thing in terms of connecting and engaging. No one knows the students better.
Yeah.
At the same time, that requires nuance, a nuance to how we do things. You know, how we do things across the grades, age and stage, but also how we do things across disciplines too. I think of, you know, as a background of being an English language teacher and a social science teacher, discussion is primacy, right? Like, to get kids that social construction of knowledge, to have a chance to understand and talk through the learning is critical. And I think, to, you know, answer Justin's question, there are going to be technologies that will support that. And so how do we maximize, how do we leverage that to the nth degree? That's, for me, is the real shift. That balance between who's leading the learning and the ability or the power of saying, I'm going to let go of some control. I'm going to give them this platform, tool, breakout room, whatever it is, and I'm going to let them learn. And I'm going to check in as I do. You know, my assessments for and of and as learning, observation, conversations, those things. But it is how do we maximize the relationship with those students and the teacher to develop that trust in the classroom?
Yeah. Look, I think it's probably shifted again quite naturally, and teachers are starting to see the benefits. As far as the tool goes and the tools go, the technology has mostly been there and has been there for the last 15 years. You know, when I was working in higher ed 15 to 20 years ago, we were moving all our courses online. That was my job, was to move all the postgrad courses online and train up the educators, the lecturing staff to manage that. And then it sort of seemed to drop off, because now I'm hearing about the universities, you know, some of them are struggling, and I thought they were so far ahead, but they seem to drop the ball. They got quite complacent, dropped the ball on it, and now they're really focused on it again too. So there's certainly a lot we can learn from the higher ed sector when it comes to that. But yeah, look, I think it is slowly shifting, and I think it takes a very courageous leader to make the call on some of these things. You know, the dismantling of the timetable, you know, to what extent is that possible in most schools, and to what extent is a school leader willing to push that one? You know, down to simple things like, you know, moving school diaries, student diaries, and teacher curriculum planners online. You know, it's always been a bugbear of mine about us spending thousands of dollars annually to print student diaries when they should be using, they've got Outlook as part of their email setup, or Google Calendar, or whatever it is. When they get into universities in the real world, they have to know how to use those tools. And so why don't we start when they're at school?
In your article, you use the quote, "You never let a good crisis go to waste," and I think we have been pushed into some of those areas. Thinking across, you know, just 10 independent schools that I can, you know, name, everyone has approached reimagining their timetable slightly differently, and so there is this wealth of learning that we will be able to kind of come together. And Cohort 21 is a great vehicle for us to kind of capture all of this, because we have in some ways blown up our timetables out of a necessity. And I know, Garth, like you've developed one specifically around student well-being, and it's, you've learned some things from that, and some of them
whoever would have thought that some very well-established independent schools would go from a full year rotational model to quintmesters. right? I mean, the ability, don't waste a crisis, like the ability to just think differently and to know that for the large part, parents or clients are going to say, oh yeah, okay, we'll go with you on this. We'll try it out.
Yeah. So we've had a bit of that imposed on us. I actually think it's revealed some really great insights, and that will be kept after this. I was also thinking as you were talking is, the tools will come and go, but it's the patterns that will remain. So we're starting to see interesting sociocultural kind of norms that we'll want to maintain. So in this format, cameras and their presence of being on has a massive impact on accountability. Having tools that allow you to measure accountability, whether it's did they watch the video, did they do the thing, did they understand, like taking formative assessment to the next level when there's distance. Formative assessment was always like an organic kind of process where so much would have been inferred by the teacher just watching, right? And I can tell you are on it and you're not. And I've got lots of data coming at me from lots of different sources. And I take all of that in and I make my, professional judgments and decisions. Whereas now that's gone. So tools need to kind of replace some of that. And the companies that are doing a good job are the ones that understand that and are sitting in between the student and the teacher and providing a really kind of interesting engagement that's often, quite simple or integrated into, the workflow of the lesson or whatever else it is. So yeah, there's some neat patterns emerging.
Absolutely, and there'll be more and more products come out as a result of this. And even a product like Microsoft Teams.
Right.
There's announcements coming out from Microsoft weekly as they, try and get ahead of Zoom constantly. It's fantastic. They're leaping ahead, and they are listening to the educators as well, which is they've never done before.
That's right.
Mary-Lou, what else do you see on the horizon? What else do you see coming up? You've talked about timetables. You've talked about this heatology. What's one other thing you think is going to be significant on the horizon?
Certainly the micro-credentialing is a big one. And that will come as part of this move as schools move to blended learning. I think we'll see a huge growth there. Another thing too is that we've already lost the constraints of geographical location. I mean, technology like this that we're on now with Zoom has been around for 25 years with Skype and products like that. And you just could not get teachers using this technology in a classroom. We could not get teachers using it 15, 20 years ago in higher ed. We ran sessions for them because they needed to record themselves on video to deliver online sessions. So there's a huge jump there.
Tell me more about blended learning and these micro-credentials. What if you could describe blended learning? How would you do that?
For me, it's again around personalized learning. So and self-directed learning. So it's letting students have that option of whether they tap in or how they access the teacher's expertise. So I really see teachers as the content experts in the space. And the content is online, but students can move through it online, but also can tap into the expertise of the teacher. So it can free up the teacher in the classroom to work with the students that need that further assistance or have questions, whereas you'll have some that will just shoot ahead, and that's perfectly fine too. So,
and for me, that really resonates with this whole conversation around more self-directed learning, where students can take a little bit more agency and autonomy, and that's one of the 4 elements of engagement, right? And really drive their learning. And for me as an educator, this notion of freeing up time to work with students in the way that they can and want to work, appeal to their strengths, build up their gaps, is really strong. So how would you define a micro-credential?
Micro-credentials are more like snapshots of learning almost. There are so many options out there, and I've been doing them on MOOCs for the last 4 years. I love them. They're everywhere. There's Coursera, there's FutureLearn is another one that I use quite a bit. But they're a credential often from a university, but where you're doing just a unit of work from a full degree course or a diploma course. And you can actually get a certificate at the end of it to say you've completed that unit. So I don't see why students in senior school or senior high school, why they couldn't be doing micro-credentials out there, and why we're not incorporating them into our curriculum as well and giving them options to do micro-credentials. Because when they leave school with a portfolio that shows that they have done, say, units on online marketing or social media out of a marketing degree course, and they've got, I don't know, it might be business accounting out of a Masters of Business from a university in Scotland, or, you know, it could be anything. Why you wouldn't take a look at that as part of a student's portfolio over, well, we have our final assessment, our ATAR mark at the end of year 12. And I know it's different in Canada, but to me, what is more purposeful? Which of the students would I want if I was choosing students for a higher ed course? I want the one that can show me that they've actually taken initiative, they're lifelong learners, they're learning beyond the classroom, they've got that autonomy, they're self-directed learners, they can self-manage, they tick all the boxes.
Yeah, I'm just conscious of our time. Justin, do you have any last questions for Mary Lou before we sign off?
No, I just thought the parting thought there would be, I can certainly see it also playing a role in staff professional growth, because there aren't, outside of the formal processes, it just seems to be a really great way of both embedding something that we'd like to see happen in the classroom. And we always struggle with an accountability layer when it comes to growth. It's always tended to be in the hands of the teacher, but the credential allows you to kind of safely say, hey, let's reach for these kind of small chunks, and then there is this idea of like movement and grasping something and getting it. So I really like where you ended there.
Yeah, Mary Lou, thank you so much. We're going to wrap this up now, but thank you so much for your time. I promised you that she would deliver some joy, no doubt some inspiration, and you've delivered. Thank you so much. We've talked about heutology. We've talked about the connection between JK to grade 12 and university. We've talked about digital transformations, the changing role of the teacher, and whether that's precipitated by technology or COVID, it doesn't really matter. Education is changing. So I recommend to all of our Cohort 21 and anyone who's come across this, you have to follow Mary Lou on Twitter. She's brilliant. She's generous in her retweets too. Thank you. And follow her on LinkedIn too. You've got some great connections, and it's really nice that you are operating in the educational sector, but you broaden what that means for someone who is just living in a JK to 12 educational sector. And that broadening of scope is invaluable at this time period. So Mary Lou, thank you so much.
Thank you both for having me, and I wish you well with the year ahead, and to everyone in Cohort 21. I love your work. Keep it up.
Thanks so much. Okay, so we're going to push this out, and hopefully those of you who are listening, we will see you in our third face-to-face on February 6th, 2021.